I'm a historian by training. My bachelor's, master's, Ph.D. are in American history. And I think history is important. I think history is really, really important. To not really think about your history, to me, is sort of like growing up to be 25 years old and never asking, where did I come from? And that was the astounding kind of thing, if that happened. So I think it's important because it really is a sense of identity. When you look at history, you find out who you are. And an historian works in a particular kind of way. In other words, what you do is you try to take little pieces of evidence that you find, and you never have it all, and you try to put it together in some way that makes sense. Picture for yourself, in a minute, for yourself, a jigsaw puzzle. A jigsaw puzzle of about 1,000 pieces. I'll take about 700 of those pieces and throw them on the floor. And then you try to put together what's left. And you know what's left. What's left is a lot of holes in that puzzle. You don't have a big picture at all of what that's about. That's what historians do. They try to fill those holes by evidence they have, and then trying to connect things, and then trying to interpret things. That's the same thing a lawyer does when he takes a deposition. You try to get information, but you don't have all the information, and yet you try somehow to make interpretations. So it always intrigued me, and I started going to Greece in 1980, first time I ever went. And subsequently, because for those of you who don't know me, I used to teach at Northwestern University in the Graduate School of Management, and I gave management seminars in Greece, and I kept going there in the 90s a lot. So I've probably been there about 15 times maybe in my life. And each time I went, I met a new relative, got a little information, thought about what was going on, told what they digested kind of what they told me, and try to put together some kind of a picture of really, could I really find out something about my dad? Because you always ask, you grow up and you never sit down. Maybe some of you have, but I never sat down with my dad and said, tell me about your life. Tell me what you did. Tell me what you hoped for. What were your aspirations? What were your dreams? What would you have done if you didn't come to Greece? If you didn't have to come from Greece here, what would you have done with your life? Did you ever have any girlfriends? All those kind of questions that you never ask your parents. And then you grow up and you get married, and you go to college and you have kids, and your parents die, and then it's too late. And then it's really, really too late. And that always bothered me, that I had never really taken that time to sit down and talk to that man. I always thought my dad, if he changed that uniform, would look like an SS man. He didn't look like a Greek at all. I mean, he was very, very fair. Sure, I knew my dad, but I didn't know that man. I didn't know him at all. My dad came here when he was about 22, 23 years old. He didn't get married until he was almost 40 years old. So there was another big gap, 23 to 40. What was he doing here? What was he doing in Chicago? Did he have any girlfriends here? Did he have a business? What was he doing all those years, from 23 till he's almost 40 years old when he got married? Those were a lot of questions that I began to think about and want to do something about. And the important thing for me here this afternoon is not so much to talk about my book, although I want to. I want you to think about a process and think about things in your life that maybe you'd like to know more about. I'm going to ask my granddaughters to pass out right now. This granddaughter in white is Marissa. This one is Gianna. And that's Sophia. They're going to pass out a card. And if you need a pen, they're going to give you a pen. And I want you to think about some things I'm going to be talking about. Again, not because of my life, but because of your life and your particular family. of you who aren't familiar with Greece, this is the general area over here that I'm talking about, where my dad was born. That general area there. He was born in a village called Ios Andreas. For those of you who aren't Greek, that's St. Andrews. And that's close to another town called Astros. It's a small, very pretty village. That's where he came from. And of course, this whole area here, all of this area has an enormous historical kind of interest. As a historian, it also interested me. Who came there? Who populated there? What are the kind of people what kind of civilization was actually, created there? So, what I'd like you to do first of all is to think about in your own family. Think about somebody or some persons that you really would like to know more about, that you don't know much about at all. It could be your father, your mother, your grandfather, an uncle. Think about some person right now that you say, I really wish I knew more about them. And write down just a couple of bullet points about what do you know about that person you don't know much about. Just take 1 second now and write out what do you know about the person, what do you know about the person that you really want to find out more about. It won't take a lot of time. Just put a few thoughts down there, because I want you to think about this as we go through it. Okay, once you've got some of those down, just start thinking about what would you do to be able to find out some answers to those things you don't know about. What would you do? Is there anybody left you could talk to? Is there documentation you could find? If you live in America, ancestry kind of research is fairly easy to do. If you're in Greece, it's not so easy to do. First of all, I didn't know the language very well. I don't speak very well at all, and I can't read Greek. I can understand a lot, but even if I could get to the documentation, there wouldn't be much help for me. But in your own situations, think about where would you go and how would you really find out. So who are you? What do you know about your origins? What do you really, really, really know about your family? What do you really know about who they are, where they came from, what kind of background they had? All those kinds of things. That's my mom and dad, and that's my mom and dad. My mom and dad on the left are the mom and dad I remember. The mom and dad on the right, I have no idea about. Think about the picture you have of your mother and father. What picture do you have of your mother and father? My guess is it's probably one when you were about 20, 25 years old, maybe. But probably you don't have much of a picture a visual picture in your mind when you were 5 or 6 or 7 years old. So yeah, I knew these people okay. Except I can't do this because I'm technologically challenged. Those I knew.
Those I didn't know. Didn't know very well, at all, in terms of who they are. What did I know about my dad? And that's what I just asked you. What did I actually know before I even started anything? Well, I knew he was born in Greece, in this village. I knew he was one of 8 children. I knew that he had his brother, Mike, who I was named after, came here very, very early, beginning of the 20th century. I knew that he came to Chicago because of his brother. That's why he came here instead of New York or someplace else, because his brother was here. I knew he worked at a Chicago pie company, which used to deliver pies to restaurants all over Chicago. He was a truck driver delivering pies. I knew that. I knew he worked with his brother Mike at a place called Boyson Bakery, which was a bakery that also delivered bread, sweet rolls to restaurants as well. I knew that he married my mom in 1937. He was 39. We think he was older, actually, after doing more research. There's a thing in my family about lying about your age. And I swear that when I turn 50, I'm never going to do that. We think he was a little older. We think he was probably about 43, actually, when that happened. My mother was 25. That's what I knew. That's it. And so instead of just talking a little more, he did talk periodically about being in the Army. Talked about that a lot to me, and I got a real sense that that's what he really liked. He really liked the military. And as he talked to me about those kinds of things, when I did have a chance, my dad worked all the time. He was working long, long, long hours. And so it wasn't always that we had a lot of time to do that. Okay, that's the part of your note. Is it your mother, your father, the note card, you wrote that down already. How did I find out? One of the jobs I've had in my career is I was Deputy Undersecretary of Education in the U.S. Department of Education in Washington. And they invited me to go to Greece. First time I went, 1980. And I went to my dad's village, and they thought I was the President of the United States or something. They all came out. It was a wonderful kind of thing, but they all came out and had like a big deal because I was there, and I was a governmental official from the federal government, and they all came out. And I began, this gentleman here is my cousin. His name is Manoli Berdalis. He just died about 2 years ago. He's an individual who was in the military, and he rose to be a general in the Greek army. And he's retired. And he was a wonderful, wonderful man. And he took me to the village as we walked around, and they had a big deal for me, and I started asking questions, not only of him, but of any relatives I met. And when I went, I was shocked. I was shocked because I walked in the village, and I saw a large number of blonde people, blue-eyed people. My older daughter, Patty's not here, she's in Jamaica. But if you smell my older daughter, you'd see she has piercing blue eyes. And the first time in my life, ever, in Greece, I saw a little boy walking around with flaming red hair. Flaming red hair. Like an Irish kid, walking around. And I began to think, what's going on here? I mean, who are these people? I mean, you got these light-haired people, these blondes, these blue-eyed, this red-headed kid walking around. So I began trying to ask people different kinds of things about the background of the village, who settled there, how it happened. And they began telling me stories that this actually was the second village. This was a 2-village community. This one, Ios Andreas, was down, and up very, very, very high in the mountains was the other village that they lived in called Prastos, Prastos. It was 2 villages. The original village was up in the mountains, way, way up. And when I drove up there the first time with him, he drove me crazy because we're going, these roads, by the way, are about as big as this. Big as this. And we're driving up, and he's going, I think, I'm ready. fall, you're dead. There's no way you're going to survive. But he's like, how do you like it? I said, just look ahead. And I went up to that village, and I'll tell you about it, I saw some interesting things, which also piqued my historical kind of interest, and started digging and doing some research about that. But I also found out when he brought me to the village the first time, I asked him, do you come here a lot? He said, no, I never come here. That was kind of strange. I said, what? Why don't you come here? He didn't want to answer. He just said, no, I just don't come. I just don't come. And you begin to think there's something going on here in your family. As I say in the book, and in your family too, every family has secrets. Every family has secrets. You think about there's maybe some in your own family or some you ought to dig out, if there aren't any. So these are two people that I knew in Greece. This is my cousin, Marilo. My cousins, as you might guess, because my dad got married so late, my cousins are all 20, 25 years older, my first cousins, than I am. So she that's Marilo. This is that other gentleman I just told you, the general's daughter. Her name is Jenny. Jenny was a tour guide in Greece. She was a professional tour guide. And she took tours, took people all over, and consequently knew a great deal about, because she's a tour guide, she knew a great deal about Greek history, Greek civilization, all those kinds of things. Jenny, by the way, lives in California now. She moved, she's in California, but she was there, and this lady really started telling me stuff that I had no idea about the family, because she is, again, my first cousin. And so she started telling me all kinds of things. She lives in what's called Astros Paralia. It's the beach area of Astros. And they have what they think is a grocery store, although there's nothing in that store. But anyhow, we call it a grocery store. She started telling me more and more things, about what was going on with the family. This is the village way up in the mountains in Prestos. It's a mountain village. You go literally straight up. It was a very, very important village in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then it declined, and there's just a couple hundred people who live there now. Actually, there's virtually no population there at all. So this is when I first went. This is my daughter Erin, who's sitting in the front row right now, and this is when we went in 1985, and I went to the village, and that is the home. I wanted to see, where was my dad born? That's the home on top where he was born. It's a little small, I got a picture now. There's 10 people living in this house, okay? 10 people living in that house. And then next to it, by the way, there's animals as well. So there's a lot of people in there. You try to think about the living conditions of individuals in those kind of areas. This is the home in the mountain village. They had two homes. Yeah, this is the home in the mountain village. And those are they all pretty much look alike when you go up there. So and when I saw that house, and if those of you who've been to Europe, and if you've seen the origins of your family, it's a really emotional moment. Really emotional moment. You go in there and you start thinking, wow, this is where he was born. This is where he walked around as a little boy. This is what it's a very emotional moment. And it took me some time to kind of compose myself, frankly, when that happened. This is that same gentleman who I just told you was a cadet before he became a general. He came in the 1950s to be trained in the United States. That's me in high school. That's my brother, the judge, right there. And that's a cousin, that's my Uncle Mike's daughter. So I had met him, but of course I was only a kid. I was only a teenage kid. I didn't pay much attention to him when he came. So I didn't ask him anything at that particular time. So the combination of all these things began giving me information to piece some things together. So when I ask you, where would you go? What would you do? How would you begin finding out? I don't know how you'd find out. You'd have to tell me. I mean, could you get information on your family from any living people? Anybody? Yeah. Where would you get it?
Well, I have a similar situation like you. My dad got married when he was 50, and he was the youngest. So all my cousins, first cousins on that side, are a lot older than me. And I heard from a cousin who I never knew when I was living in Greece a great story to me about why my dad came to the United States, and it was totally out of character because we all relate to our fathers, daddy and so forth. My dad had fallen in love with a local girl, and the local bandit, bad guy, also was after her. And there was a gunfight in the Platea, and the bad guy grabbed this lady, a neighbor, and she got shot. Nobody got killed. And so then my father's older brothers all decided they all had to leave Greece. This is like 1928, 29. Either they would have been arrested or there'd be a vendetta. So they all went to the United States, Massachusetts. Slowly they all went back, but then the sort of cherry on the sundae of the story that my dear old cousin told me is that the bandit did kidnap her and make her marry him, but then she poisoned him.
It's a great book. It's a great book.
And the bandit's name was Katsiko Petros.
That's
I
a
just
great
thought,
book.
and I'm sitting there listening to this story like 8 years ago, and my, whatever, a cousin who found me by chance, and he's telling me the story, and he's about 85 years old, this cousin. And my dad got in a gunfight over, I just thought it was the most fabulous thing, frankly, that I've ever heard.
I think you got the kernel of the book.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think every family does. I think every family really does. I have that. These are my dad's brothers. One of them I always heard was a little weird. I mean, I don't know if he was kind of playing with a full deck, honestly. I mean, he was kind of strange. Everybody said, I don't know about him. And the other one was okay, but one was I didn't know why. I didn't know why he was kind of why would they say something like that, about him. So I began thinking about what could that be, and how could I weave that kind of a thing into a story. This is what you got to do, I think, if you don't have all the pieces, because my book is, I said, partially very true. The historical stuff is true, but some of the stuff is fiction. Some I had to make up. That's why it's a historical novel as opposed to being a biography, because I didn't have all the pieces there. I had to put those pieces together. And so I began, think about, let your imagination go. Think about some rumors about your family. You just told me one. Maybe some of you have some other ones that you either know or heard about. And imagine what kind of story you might create. Does anybody have any rumors you want to share? Like your grandfather was a sheep thief, or yeah.
My grandmother was a bootlegger.
Your grandmother was a bootlegger?
In Illinois. She raised 5 daughters and a son by selling lunches to the guys that worked in John Deere,
Yeah.
right across from where her home was. And when her husband was killed in an accident, she had to make a living. So she made wine and booze, and she sold it. And she was shot.
She was shot?
She was shot by another food vendor. But she survived, and it was a wound. And he had to leave town. That's the movie, that's the story.
Wow. Anybody else have anything like that? Any kind of weird, strange kind of things?
Oh, we've got another
Remember
one.
my Uncle Jim?
Yeah.
He was in front of the office.
Stay loud. Stay loud, they can't hear you.
Oh, he was a friend of Al Capone's.
So,
And he also had, we've been, my mother told me that, you say, about these guys, and did they have girlfriends? Well, Uncle Jim evidently did, because he had a daughter who was with a girlfriend. And she was actually, my mom said, came to the house to visit him. So he had an illegitimate daughter. And I frankly think a lot of these guys probably did. Why not? I mean, that's only
Which I didn't know till about an hour ago.
Pat? Oh, I got two Pats. What Pat found is first.
Oh, okay.
Pat, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Pat.
Okay, one of the relatives I won't mention, who was an illegal immigrant, and I think of that often when we talk about illegal immigrants. And I think quite a few maybe of our weekends.
My father-in-law is an illegal immigrant.
Oh.
Well, they're all legal now.
Pat?
Well, my father was born here, but his mother died at a young age, and so he was probably, had liberties that maybe he wouldn't have had if his mother was alive. And he used to tell me he used to swim out to the lighthouse with Johnny Weissmiller, who was an athlete years ago, in Chicago here, by Navy Pier.
Yeah.
He used to swim out for donuts and coffee and everything.
That's great. That's great. I think we all, if you start probing around and thinking about what you don't know or what you heard, I think we'd all probably find something. This is the only picture I have of my grandfather. Some of you know, what's his name, Dr. What's his name, George?
Gosh, I know you're talking about it.
The guy who used to have who's the movie, he used to do the movies. Dr. Panos. Dr. Panos. Dr. Panos is a dentist. He used to have a little studio over here, and he did Greek programs. So my brother and I walked into his studio one day, and we see this picture, or virtually this picture. And I said, what? I said, Ernie, who is that? He said, that's my grandfather. I said, Ernie, that's my grandfather. That's my grandfather. It was that picture. Or if it wasn't, it was a clone of that picture. I said, that's my grandfather. He said, no, that's not your grandfather. I said, that's my grandfather. So I began to think, well, that's something I could do in a story. And I'll tell you how I did it. But it was a strange kind of phenomenon, because it wasn't like, it kind of looks like, it was like, that's it. It was like, that's the picture. Exactly. This is a colleague of my dad's when he was in the Army. And I don't remember his name, but my dad used to talk about him. And so I thought he would also be a character I think I could use somehow, in the book. And I did incorporate him into the book as well. I don't know why he's posing like that, but very honestly.
I would like to see a Rudolph Valentino. at some point.
This is my Uncle Mike on the left, my dad's brother. This is my dad. The only picture I've known with my dad who had hair. The only picture we have where he had hair, because he lost it all. And you can see, as I said, it doesn't look very Greek at all. And this lady here is a lady my uncle married, the first of his 3 wives. that he married. And I knew that, but I couldn't always figure out why. My Uncle Mike was an interesting character. As I said, he came over here in the early 20th century. Everything I've heard about him was that he was the total opposite of my father. He well, not only had 3 wives, but I think many more women beside that. He was one of the first people to own motorcycles in Chicago. He drove motorcycles around. He drove his car. He'd get in the car, early cars in the early part of the 20th century. If somebody frustrated him, he'd bang into him. Bang into him. Get out of my way, bang. He was a guy who my dad told me was, fast with his fists, because at that time, Greeks were not readily accepted. My grandfather's store, they broke his window in his candy store, dirty Greeks, who are you, greaseball, all that kind of stuff was going on. We should remember that there's an organization, for those of you who don't know, called the AHEPA, American Hellenic Progressive Association. The AHEPA was formed in response to the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan, which is after Greeks and Italians and Jews and Catholics and everybody. That's why the AHEPA was formed, to respond to the Klan. So it wasn't an easy time, and you had to be willing to fight with your fists. That's a final picture of my mom and dad when they were on their honeymoon. And now I want to get to some of the story. As I said, that's kind of a background. My dad began telling me stories, and one story he really did tell me, because it's stuck in his brain so well, and it's in the book, is that his sister, it's a poor family, you gotta remember, it's 8 kids. They're very poor people. I mean, my grandfather owned a little grocery store. My name, the origin of my name really in Greek means grocer. So there must have been a tradition of grocers for many, many generations. And he had a small grocery store. It's eight kids in that little house. They're very poor. And it wasn't advantageous to have daughters, because you had to have a dowry. You had to have a dowry you just didn't marry somebody, they'd go out and date and get married. You had to have a dowry. And they had no money. So they were going to marry off my dad's older sister to this man. A little older, not real old, but a little older. And of course, she didn't want him. She didn't like this guy. She didn't know this guy. She didn't want to marry this guy at all. That isn't what she wanted. And yet, they persisted that she had to do it because they had no money. They could not give her a dowry for this. So she went one day with my dad. My dad was about 10 years old. She was about 19, I think, or 18. They went out in the fields. She went because they all were very handy with guns, all of them. She went out in the field, and she asked my dad apparently to, go find something. She took this rifle, took her shoe off, put her toe in the trigger, pulled it, killed herself. Because she would not marry this guy. She would not marry and live and sleep with this guy who she didn't want, she didn't even know. She wouldn't do it. That story my dad did tell me, because obviously when you're 9 or 10 years old, it sticks in your mind. I mean, your sister she commits suicide in that kind of a situation because of and I don't think we can totally understand the pressure of these villages when they had these kind of kids, these number of kids, and they were poor. And again, if you didn't get married, you were in big trouble in these villages. You had to get married in some way. So one of the stories I start out with in Katerina, I called it, that was her name. That's a true story. That chapter is an absolutely true story in the book of what went on. But then I thought, well, she's got all these other kids I can write something about too. I can really weave a story for some of these others. When somebody dies, at least at that time, I don't know if it's true now, those of you might tell me, at least at that time, after a while, the family would go and they would actually dig up the bones There was a ritual to get kind of finality to things. They would dig up the bones, and there was a process, and they would wash these with wine and with water, and the priest would say all kinds of religious kinds of things, and then they would put them in some other kind of container, and that was a common kind of village ritual. So I pictured that, and I did some research on it, and I tried to show it, and I have the other sister, a second sister there, and she sees a guy. This guy sees her, and he takes an interest in her. And because she's naive, and he keeps coming into the grocery store, and he's flirting with her, and she's flirting back, but she's a very naive young girl, he eventually takes her out in the woods, and he rapes her. He rapes her. And of course, that is such a dishonor to the family. If anybody knew about that, your family is finished. If anybody even found out about that kind of thing. So I began to think, what would I do with that part of the story, and how would I kind of weave that in? And so I'll let you, if you want to read the book, you can find out. But I go in there and I talk about how, in fact, my dad, who then was about 17 years old, goes to this guy, confronts him, and beats the crap out of him. Just beats him. Doesn't kill him, but beats him and tells him, "You've got to marry my sister. And if you don't marry my sister, I'm going to kill you." Because the honor of the family is that important. You cannot lose that. You lose that in the village, you're done. You're done. The family's finished. You must preserve that kind of honor. And so he does that. They do get married. It's not a happy marriage at all. As you would guess, it wouldn't be a happy marriage at all. And then I leave that. Then remember I said there was this weird uncle. I said there was this weird kind of uncle that was kind of strange. The way I weave that into that is that I had him as a young boy afflicted by the evil eye. Y'all know what the evil eye is? It's sort of you're possessed by some kind of a curse like, and they usually say sometimes it can be cured by, it can't be cured, it can be cured by a lot of ways: prayers, garlic, crosses, prayers. Where if you go out in the gift shop, you'll see some thing with an eye out there, the evil eye, which is supposed to get that away as well. And I have him, obsessed by that. And they bring in this lady to try to do some hokey pokey, and that doesn't work. And they bring in a priest, and the priest starts saying prayers, and eventually, he's okay. And so my dad's mother says to his brother, "I want you not to be a priest, but I want you to be religious. I want you to help the priest. I want you to go to church all the time. I want you to do whatever he asks you to do. I want you to really, really be close." And as the story develops, my dad's brother, that weird guy I told you, becomes weirder and weirder, and becomes closed. He doesn't talk. He's not very gregarious. And everybody's wondering, what's going on? What's happening? What's happened to him? His name's Manolo. What's happened to him? And we find out after a while, I took this from contemporary stuff, that he's been abused. That he's been abused by the priest. Well, was married. They knew he had kids, because in the Greek Orthodox Church, priests can be married. And had kids. So then I said, well, wow, how am I going to respond to that kind of thing? So I've got two things going on. I've got this one guy who raped his sister, and he's really not having a good marriage. Then I got this other brother who's been abused by a priest. So I've got to take care of that somehow. I got to deal with that somehow in the book. Well, I didn't want to have my dad do it. My dad's too good a guy. So remember I said his brother was a different kind of guy. His brother was a different kind of man. Much more, less Greek. He came here so early. He didn't have really, he came here so early, a very young man, in the 20th century. He's really an American. He's an American immigrant. He's taken on the values of America, but he's also, as I said, kind of irresponsible, kind of a violent kind of guy, if he wants to be. So I bring him back. He comes back. My dad writes him and says, I need your help. The family's in trouble. We got these two things going on. I don't know what to do about it. So you got to come. So he does come. He comes back, gets to know his sister who was raped, gets to know her husband because he had never met him before. He had never been there. So he gets to meet them. And then he tells this guy who raped the sister, his name is Yorgos. He says, Yorgos, come here. I got a deal for you. He says, you know, we got some girls up in the mountains there. We can really have a good time with these girls. And, you know, this Yorgos says, yeah, but I'm your sister's husband. He says, yeah, I don't care. Don't worry about that. It's irrelevant. He says, I'm married too. It doesn't matter. Then we got these Bulgarian girls up there, and they are beautiful. And man, let's go up there. So he takes him to that village I just talked to you about, way up in the mountains. Way up in the mountains. And eventually then gives him an offer he can't refuse. He tells him, look, I'm going to give you a choice. This is what you've done. You son of a, you know, this is what you've done to my sister. Here's your choice. You can jump off this ledge and maybe latch onto something and live, and you'll be lucky, or I'm going to shoot you in the head. Take your choice. What do you think he did?
Jump.
He jumped. And of course, he splattered. Because nobody can survive that kind of a leap. The same evening, my Uncle Mike goes back to the village, tells the priest, Father, I need to confess. And the priest says, oh, okay. He says, a lot of us don't do confession, but if you want to confess, that's fine, come on. So he goes, it's night, it's raining, he goes into the church, he's all alone with the priest. He says, Father, I want to confess. He says, well, what's on your mind? And he says, well, I don't understand it, but I like men. He says, I like men. He says, you like men? He says, yeah, I like men. He says, I don't get it, but I like men. He knows, of course, this priest is a pedophile. He knows that. But he's trying to egg him on, and the priest starts giving him all this hokey pokey about what the church believes and all this kind of stuff about homosexuality and all these kinds of things. And then finally, after he gives him this dialogue goes on, my uncle pulls out a gun, shoots him in the heart, falls to the floor. He says, one for the Father, shoots him again. That's for the Son, shoots him again. That's for the Holy Ghost. He leaves. Goes back to America, no one ever sees him again, never goes back to Greece again, and he takes care of that. There's another brother to take care of, the other brother. My dad used to be, when he was a young man, what you and I would call a Pony Express rider. He would get on, they would deliver mail from one village to the other, he'd get on a horse and he'd ride. My dad was a very good horseman, actually. And he would ride from one village to another delivering mail. A couple of years ago, a gentleman at church, at Assumption Church, you guys know John Sanders, came up to me and he said, is your dad a mailman in Greece? I said, yeah, he was. He said, you know, my mother was in a different village, and she remembers that because all the girls used to wait for him when he came because he was so good looking. So he used to deliver mail. So this other brother would deliver mail as well. And he goes to this village, his other brother goes to the village and he meets this girl. And he falls in love with this girl. In Argos, another close by village, he falls in love with her. My dad is sitting in a cafe and he overhears some men talking about that grandfather picture I showed you before. And he says, you know, that his name was Christos. He says, that Christos, he's a real womanizer. This guy plays around with women all the time. You know, he goes to all these villages like he's a grocer picking up produce and all that. But beside that, he's got women all over. My dad's listening to this. And he's saying, well, that can't be true. That just can't be true. But it starts bothering him. And he starts going and looking and he says, he goes to this village and something begins to bother him about this relationship that his brother's having with this girl. And he starts digging about where he starts meeting this woman who had the girl. He starts talking to her. And finally she says, yeah, she did have a relationship with his grandfather. She did. And that this girl that my dad's brother was in love with was really his half-sister. And so you have the elements of a true Greek tragedy going on here. And so he has to go, my dad, do something about that. And he tries to resolve it, and of course it's never worked out. The girl becomes a nun, she goes to a convent, because for those of you who don't know, the Greek Orthodox Church, there are nuns as well. Not too many anymore, but there are. And she goes to a convent, and he survives, but he's not well, kind of the rest of his life. So I try to weave a lot of these kinds of things in. But then I said, what my dad really wanted to do, of course, and what he wanted to do with his life was be in the Army and have a career in the military. That's would have been his dream. That's why I think my cousin Manoli, who became a general, I think my dad always kind of looked at him and said, you know, that could have been me maybe if fate hadn't intervened and I had to come to America. The only reason he came to America is because he had to pay off, he was paying for dowries for the rest of his sisters. That's why he came. That they had no money, so he had to come here to make the money, send it back to marry off all these sisters. So I think he always thought maybe that would have been a career that would have been something that he would have liked. So he does go into the Army, and he really did. And as you can see from that original photograph, he goes into the Army. Then I began thinking, he's 18, 19 years old. What is he doing, in the Army? He was he could shoot. One time I went hunting in my life. I went with my dad. I shot the thing, almost killed me, but I did shoot the rifle, but only one time. But he was a hunter. He could use a gun very, very well. He used it as a young boy. And I tried, he told me stories about that, because he did, he fought against Turks, he fought against the Bulgarians, he was involved in combat. He was involved in all of those kinds of things, and he would tell me these stories, and I try to envision with his friend what that might be like. And so I had him going in Thessaloniki, which is a city in northern Greece, again, for those of you who might not know, and have him. My dad was a very kind of reserved person. He didn't talk a lot. He was, what the Spartans would call laconic. He was very sparse in terms of words. He'd say things, and that was it. I mean, I would call my father and talk to him on the phone, and I would say, Dad. He hung up. He wouldn't say goodbye. He would just be talking, all of a sudden the phone would go down. He wouldn't say goodbye. He didn't talk nearly a lot at all. So I have him going, and I have him going into this place, this kind of a hashish den, because he told me there were many of them there, that he had gone to some of them when he was in the Army. And it was very common, and they would play, again, for those of you who are not or Greek, they would play the Zembekiko music, which was from the Zembek area, and it's a dance where the men particularly are dancing kind of by themselves, and they're kind of interpreting things all by themselves. Sometimes two people get up there, but very often it's one person who's up there doing his thing. And And of course, it's filled with prostitutes as well. I mean, there's drugs there, there's prostitutes. It's a typical kind of thing. And so, again, I let my imagination go on this because I don't know this for a fact, but I had my dad then obviously, smoking a little of this stuff, and then a young lady comes up to him and he walks away with her up to the upper room, and again, that's my imagination. I have no evidence of that whatsoever, but I did that. I told you that we all had to think about, I always wondered if my dad had any girlfriends before he came. He must have. He was 20, 21, 22 years old when he came here. I mean, he must have had somebody. My mother always used to kid my father about his girlfriend. And I used to hear it, and it was fine. And I think when they went back to Greece in 1968, I think they actually met this lady. But I always wondered about it. And when I went to Greece, I said, I'm going to find this lady. So I tried to find her. She would have been probably in her mid-80s by that time. I did get to where she lived. Unfortunately, she had died the year before. But I met her son. Her son and I talked for about an hour. We talked about things, and he told me, he said, my mother did talk about your dad. The reason my dad, the name of the book is Yanelli. My dad's name was John, which is Gianni. But Yanelli is kind of like Johnny. If somebody named John, we call him Johnny. Yanelli is Johnny. She said, yeah, my mother talked about Yanelli a lot. And it kind of verified for me, yeah, there probably was something that was going on there, and that he had to leave. Did he love her? I don't know, maybe. But he had to leave. Your life is totally disrupted. When you have to come to another country, you can't speak a word of English, you know one person in the whole country. It's pretty powerful stuff. And yet, so I had to figure out how would that relationship have played itself out. I don't know if you can, Paul, if you can play that, I don't know if you can play that just for 2 seconds, if anybody can even hear this. My dad was a great Greek dancer. He was an outstanding Greek dancer. That's a song called Itya. It's my dad's favorite song. A song which still sometimes makes me choke up. I hear it. He was not the kind of dancer you'd think was from Barnum and Bailey. Some of these guys, they're slapping their hands and they're doing twirls and they're jumping up and down. He wasn't like that at all. He was an elegant soldier dancer. I'm going to pay a friend a compliment now. The best dancer, second guy I've ever seen is my friend Tom. It's true. Second best I've ever seen, because he dances that way. He's not a circus dancer. And that's a song, you can turn it off, Paul, seriously. That's a song that's really from the 1821 Revolution. And it really, again, fits into the military kind of thing at all. So I had my dad doing that in a village. These villages on the feast of the day, like St. Andrew's, whatever the feast the patron saint was, would have festivals, like, we all do. And they had these festivals. So I had them coming and my dad meeting her, and then finally having that relationship evolve and develop over a time. But then he goes to the Army, he comes back, he wants to go to military school, he wants to go like my cousin Manoli did, that would be his dream. But you got 3 sisters, 2 sisters left. And you've got to go send money back to us because we're poor, and we've got to marry your sisters off. We must. So that's when he comes to America. He saves his money. He sends it back to those 2 brothers. This is true. These 2 brothers squander the money. He's got a penny left. They take it all, spend it. So you wonder why he's 40 years old by the time he gets married, because he's still working here to send money back because his 2 brothers took all that money. So that wraps up kind of how I try to weave fact and fiction together and create a story. Probably a third, if not, yeah, a little more than a third is true in the book. And probably the rest is semi-true. And at least a quarter is probably totally fiction that I had to make up. But it's still a very, very important part of my life that I was able to do that and begin digging. And I would urge you all to try to do it. Try to think about what you would actually do and what kind of stories you would actually weave together in what you're doing. And then I wanted to find out one final thing. When I ask, who are we? Where do we come from? Greece, by the way, like every country, if anybody here thinks they're pure anything, you're deluding yourselves. Absolutely deluding yourselves. Greece was invaded from all kinds of people. The Celts were in Greece in the 1st century. Maybe that's where that red-headed kid that I talked about. The Celts were there. The Venetians. You go to Napoli and you see Venetian architecture all over. The Venetians were there. The Romans obviously were there. The Turks obviously were there. The Vlachs came down from the south. They were there. The Dorians I talked about, who spoke that unique language, that Sakonica, came from the north. They think from Epirus, Thessaly. They think even further north than that. They came down. So you have had generations, thousands of years of mixture going on. Nobody is pure anything. Nobody. So I wanted to do my DNA. I'm going to do my DNA. So I did it. And I had my wife does it. $99, Ancestry.com. Also, National Geographic also does it. You can do it. Paul, can you put that on?
Yes.
It's on there? That's me, by the way. Handsome kid. Huh? At least I got some hair left. That's good. These are just patterns of where Greek traders went. You can't see it all clearly, but you know, the Greeks were seafaring people. They had it. I mean, geography didn't allow them anything else. It's a lousy land to try to farm. So you had to go to the sea. Seafaring people. They went all the way. They went up to the British Isles. They went down Africa. They were all over the place. So you got that element going on. People traveling all over, whether they're marrying, bringing women back, whatever they're doing, they're all over the place. These were some of the Greek colonies. My son-in-law Val's family is from Naples. I keep telling Val, Naples is a Greek colony. Neapolis, new city. It's a Greek colony. There are Greek colonies all over there. They got to Marseille is a Greek city. Marseille was founded by Greeks. They went all the way to the British Islands. So you had all this movement going on out of Greece, bringing people back, invaders coming in. I mean, all of that was going on. This is my wife's DNA. Some of you who are old enough, when I was a teenager and I was go to church, because I didn't understand half the stuff they were doing in church, and all I was doing is this, you know, and then people were doing this. I thought they were swatting flies and doing the cross. Because I didn't know what was going on. I was about 18, 19. I'd look around, see if they're good-looking girls in the church, and I found one. At that time, she had reddish hair. And I always kid for those of you old enough, there used to be an actress called Kim Novak.
Yeah.
She was very pretty.
Yes.
And she had blondish hair. And I've always told my wife, you've got some Slavic blood. I can tell those cheekbones, I can tell those almond kind of eyes, you've got some Slavic blood. I always told her. I don't know if you can read that. Her DNA is 70% is from Europe. Italy, Greece, and I'll get back to that, 64%. European East, which, you know, could be Poland, could be Hungary, could be, you know, any of those places. European Jewish, 1%, and from the Caucasus, 27%. That's the area. See that area? That's the Caucasus. Ukraine,
So she,
all the Slavic areas too. So I wasn't half wrong. I wasn't half wrong in my assessment. And she has some of that in her. This is me. %, Asia, whatever that means. Europe, I'm much more European than my wife. 90%. Italy, Greece, 69%. East European, 13%. European Jewish, 6%. Anybody Jewish here? I want a Hanukkah card next time. The Jews had been in Greece for centuries. Centuries. When St. Paul went to Greece to try to convert the pagan Greeks, when he went there, he found Hellenized Jews, even then. He found them. And in of course, Thessaloniki, which at one time was the most Jewish city in Europe, most Jewish city in all of Europe, was a Greek city. The Nazis, unfortunately, decimated and wiped them out until there were about 5,000, I think, left. But there's been a Jewish presence for a long, long time. So when I see, you know, I've got 6% Jewish, I was shocked when I saw it first, I gotta tell you. But when you think about it, with that kind of movement we've just talked about, it's really not that surprising. Now notice that one. They can't really distinguish Italy and Greece. My cousin, who I told you was a general, and he fought, in 1940, the Italians, Mussolini invaded Greece. And my cousin fought against not only the Italians, but the Germans, the Nazis who invaded after Mussolini really failed. Hitler came in, and the Nazis were there, and he fought against both of them. And he told me, when I talked to him, he said, you know, the Italians weren't bad. I said, we'd get together after that, they'd be prisoners of war, we'd talk, we'd eat together, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, we'd capture them, and they would say, buono greco, and they would say, you know, una faccia, una razza, you know, one face, one race, we're all the same, why are we fighting? Those Italian soldiers were right, because they don't distinguish really very directly any kind of DNA between the two, and you can understand that when you see the patterns of migration that went on. West Asia, Great Britain, look at that. In Great Britain, I got 2%. I know that. So, what's interesting about this is that when you do this, they will also send you contacts with people who have virtually the same DNA you have. So I've gotten contacts, people have contacted me already. And they have, one lady has virtually the same DNA. And they say, these people, you're definitely related in some way. It could be second, third, fourth cousins, but you're definitely related in some way. And so you can contact these people and see if there's any common kind of bond, that connection. So far I haven't found that, but it's a really fascinating kind of thing to do. So those kinds of things are important to me, because they give me a sense of who I am, who my family was, who I actually am, my kids now, my grandkids, have some idea of kind of what their origins, might happen to be. And I think it would be a good thing for all of you to really explore. How many of you anybody done your DNA? Here? Anybody going to do it?
Yes.
Yeah, you ought to really do it. And you can't be afraid of what you're going to find. Can't be afraid. You ought to do it. It's worth it. It's worth, I think, getting some sense of what's going on. Does anybody have any questions? Want to ask? Yeah.
Where would Turkey fit in? Because I've always thought that we gotta have a lot of Turkish blood. Would that be in the Caucasus?
It would be in that general area you saw that Desi had.
That'd be 400 years with the Turks.
400 years of
I'm surprised there's not more percentage that's.
Well, that doesn't mean they necessarily cohabitated, or some did obviously, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. George?
Question, did you ever find out if you're cousins with Ernie Panis?
Oh,
No, I didn't find out.
Yes,
But I'd like
father.
to, it'd be nice for Ernie to do this, to do the DNA. So I could find out if that grandfather really was, we had the same grandfather.
Maybe you're cousins.
Yes.
Mike, it's nice to see you again. I have a question. What happened to the two sisters that got screwed out of their money by their brothers?
They got married, and actually, I know their family now. They did get married, because my dad sent back more money. He had to send back more money so they'd have a dowry so they could get married, yeah. The dowry lasted a pretty long time, I think. I don't know. Somebody knows better.
Still technically exists.
I don't think it's really
Yeah.
operational anymore, but I think maybe up to the 50s, maybe?
No, I think it was outlawed in about the 80s, early 80s.
In the 80s?
People still give their daughters apartments or houses, and prospective grooms in Greece want to know what she's getting. It may legally not exist, because it used to be that when the big guy, you didn't pay any transfer tax on property. So that finished.
Yeah.
But traditionally, the Greek is still
Okay.
there, the way it was.
Well, I hope, as I said, yeah. Al?
Mike, you don't establish your real last name? Was
Yeah.
it changed?
No, it wasn't, no, my last name was not changed on immigration, no. It actually, though, what I did look at, there is a Turkish word for grocer called Bakal, B-A-K-A-L. So I don't know if that was just because they were there so many years that they started mixing those words and languages, but the B-A-K-A-L is a grocer in Turkish. So my sense is that there was some adopting of language that came on in 400 years. That's a long time, for not to have. Somebody else had a question? Yeah.
I became interested in what you're doing about 8 years ago. And so I researched my father fairly easily because he was still around for a while. And I went back and I went to Ellis Island and I tracked all their migrations and his brothers all over the place. And what we're addressing here is that there's a cultural issue about families because they're compact and at one point in time when they were with the village, they knew all of their past, they knew all of their relatives to an extent. I think that that's dissolved quite a bit because of our fluid society.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a cultural issue that you're trying to connect with? Or is that something we're trying to remedy?
I don't know. I mean, as I said, to me, it's a matter of identity. I'm trying to, I want to find out about who I am, where I come from, what makes me what I am. Not only my family, but there's a bloodstream, there's history. There's a guy in my dad's village who has traced the family back to the 1700s. Then he says, I can't go any further than that. I stopped. My dad, by the way, when he was a young boy, he was sent to Constantinople to go to school for a short period of time. The village where he lived, at Prastosa, way up in the mountain, as I did the research, and when I went to that village, and I began looking around the buildings, I saw some symbols on the buildings. I didn't know what they were. It was a cross with kind of a rose in the center of where the crosses meet. I didn't know what it was. So I began doing research, and I found out that that town, that city, was at one time a very prosperous city. And it had a special arrangement with the Ottoman Empire where they could do trade. And so they did a lot of trade with the Ottoman Empire, with Constantinople, and they were accumulating a lot of money. But what the Turks didn't know is that the Greeks were saving this money to use against the Turks for the revolution. So the town was really a center of revolutionary activity by money. They were trying to raise money to fund the revolution against the Turks. And that village, when the Turks found out about it, they even though it was way up there, they went up there and wiped the whole village out. It was for years desolate. They just wiped it out because they identified that as a key fundraising effort for a secret society, really, that was working in the revolution. Those are the kind of things that fascinate me when you find that kind of stuff out. You begin to wonder, I mean, okay, wow, I have relatives involved in the revolution. I have relatives who were like Sam Adams in America. I mean, is that who they were? That's the kind of stuff that I think you can find. Anybody have any questions? Comments? Yeah, George.
One comment. First of all, I commend you for what you've done. And knowing you all these years, I can understand that you would do something like this. And I have, similar interests, not to the extent that you've gone, but my four grandparents, I know a little bit about three of them, and the fourth one, my maternal grandmother, I didn't know anything about her other than what village she was from. My mother would tell me what village she was from. And I've known the name of the village for my whole life. Never knew where it was at until a couple of years ago. And it's called Ziva. And I found out it's right outside of Triton. And last year I was in Greece, so I took a day off. And I drove to Ziva. And this little village, probably about 40 homes, something like that. And I drove in there, not a soul to be seen, not a car to be seen. So what do? I just park. I just have my pocket on the doors.
It's okay. I understand.
To make a long story short, I met somebody who could very well be a second cousin, and he was in a town called Utaki, and he said, I'll see you later tonight. I said, well, I'm not going to be here, but I'll drive there because I have to go back to Athens. Anyway, I met this man. And when he saw me, he just hugged me like we were cousins. I'm sorry.
It's okay, George. I know it's an emotional thing. I know.
But anyway, he said he has a mother who's 90 years old. She knows all the relations. And he says, when I see her, I'm going to ask about your family. So that didn't happen. I came back. But I told him next time I'm in Greece, I'll stop by and see you.
That's great. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing all of us ought to be doing. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here.